Hello, everyone joining our webinar tonight. We're just going to give everyone a moment to sign in here and then we'll get started. So welcome and thank you for sitting tight just a moment. All right, hello to everyone logging in. Get started in just a moment here, just giving folks a chance to log in. Right, so why don't we go ahead and get started here. So hello, my name is Kelly Bolter. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator at Milwaukee Public Library. I'm very pleased to welcome back Melinda Myers for another awesome virtual workshop here. Tonight we're going to talk about how to plan your rain garden. Currently MMSD has their annual plant sale going on. So if you're interested in getting some native plants, they're a great source to snag some and start creating your ideal rain garden for this coming growing season. So just some housekeeping before we start. You should see on the bottom of your screen a chat button and a Q&A button. Feel free to chat with your fellow attendees in that chat box, and then please submit any questions in the Q&A box. We'll have time after Melinda's presentation to answer your questions and dig into some more gardening knowledge with Melinda. We've got quite a few programs with Melinda and MMSD coming up this spring, summer, and fall. So keep an eye on the calendar at mpl.org for those opportunities. We'll have more webinars and some in-person workshops. Yeah, you'll have all kinds of chances to learn all kinds of things this spring and summer. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Melinda. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to all of you for taking time to join us and for planning a rain garden. So you're going to help make a difference by keeping water where it falls. I always like to thank our sponsors, Fresh Coast Guardians, MMSD, for sponsoring this webinar. They make it possible that I can hopefully teach, educate, and inspire all of us to do more in our landscapes and make this free to you. Also, the library. Our public libraries are important parts of our community, and I appreciate Kelly and her team taking time out and hosting these so that more people can take part. So let's get down to business. If you're here, you may already know the benefits of rain gardens, but just in case you need a reminder, they can be beautiful. One of my goals and missions is to help you not only have a rain garden that functions, but one that's beautiful so that you can enjoy it, and those passing by your landscape will also do that. It keeps water where it falls. Think about our crazy weather. We've had unbelievable weather here in southeast Wisconsin, well, throughout most of the Midwest in the country. And it seems we have drought followed by torrential rainfall. And where does that rain go? Hopefully not in the storm sewer. So by using rain gardens, they're designed to capture that water that runs off roofs and sidewalks and your lawn, capture it so the water is filtered through the roots of the plants and the soil before it reaches the groundwater, and then keeping it out of our storm sewer. So that's saving us money, that water is not overflowing the storm sewer and needing to be treated. It also can help reduce the risk of basement backups. Thinking about those torrential rainfalls, if our gardens are functioning right and we have a healthy landscape, that's a great way to keep water on the landscape instead of in your basement. And then it helps prevent water pollution or reduce the risk at least, because we're keeping the water on our landscape. So again, the plants in the soil do the filtering of pollutants instead of it going across the roads where it picks up more pollution and then into our storm sewer. Also, if we pick the right plants, and most rain garden plants are good at supporting birds and pollinators. I don't know about you, but winters can be kind of dreary, kind of crazy, and the birds really add a lot of enjoyment. They add color and motion to the landscape. They're entertaining, and the butterflies and bees that come to visit in the summer, and they need our help, and they help us back by managing insects. I think it's like 86% of songbirds eat insects, and a lot in the spring and early summer when they're breeding and feeding their young. So inviting them into our landscape not only is entertainment, but it also helps us manage garden pests. And we know we need those pollinators so we have fruit, seeds, and things to enjoy. The key to success in any gardening endeavor is planning for success. And Kelly, I said maybe if you could post the link to the handout in the chat, that would be great. We do have a handout that goes with this, and hopefully you received it today. I forgot to double check. So in the handout follows along with my talk and has some links to help you along the way. So planning for success. If you plan, you're going to minimize maintenance and increase success. You know this as any kind of gardener. If you start with a plan, you get the right plant in the right location, you select for success and less maintenance in the long run. A good resource to help you plan for success is the Rain Garden Guide from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. They have two versions you can download for free. One is high def, high quality, and the other is low def, so you won't waste a lot of ink. But what I like about this is it takes you through step by step through the process of planning a rain garden. And so it helps you go, if you've got this much water coming off your roof, you'll need a garden this side. If you have heavy clay soil, it needs to be dug this deep. And you'll see some images from this throughout because they gave me permission to share these with you. And there's lots of great resources on Fresh Coast Guardians as well to help you as you plan and plant your rain garden. So selecting the location, because we're trying to capture water, we want to keep it away from the foundation of our house. The last thing you need is more water near the basement, right? So we want to keep it at least 6, preferably 10 feet away from your home. Now, this was a very ambitious gardener. That's a huge garden. And we'll talk about size in a minute, but you can see that they've kept that garden away from their home so the water comes down the downspout just a little bit away from the house. We don't want to go too far. If it's more than 30 feet away, you're picking up a lot of water on the grass and lawn, and you'll need an even bigger rain garden. So trying to keep it in that nice distance of 10 to 30 feet from the foundation of your house. You also want to keep it 2 feet away from walks and drives. As you can see here, they're probably going to go under the sidewalk or find a way to minimize the impact of that downspout. But the reason being is you're going to dig that rain garden deep. And the last thing you want to do is ruin the integrity of your walk, because if you go too close to it, you don't have that soil structure to support it. So if you keep it a couple feet away, either with plants, a regular garden planting, mulch or something, or just leave your turf intact. Avoid those areas where water tends to pond. This is not a rain garden, okay? This is intended to drain within 24 to 48 hours. So if you have areas where you have standing water, then you may need to do a French drain, or you may need to do a rain garden ahead of it so that some of that water is intercepted rather than settling maybe in that low spot in your landscape. So you'll need to do some other things to manage those wet areas where water ponds. And one of the things you're going to want to do is contact your local municipality. You want to avoid putting your rain garden over the lateral. That way, if there's any cracks, you're not adding more water because you're digging deep. That garden is going to collect water. And again, it's going to collect more water than normal for that area. It's eventually going to drain. So they will come out and they'll mark, usually with a blue line like you see here. This is an area we installed a garden with a homeowner a couple years ago. And she has a small lot. So you can see she could only keep it away a couple feet, but at least her garden wasn't on top of that lateral. So trying to minimize the impact. Avoid trees. Tree roots go away from the trunk 2 to 5 times the height of that tree away. The majority of feeder roots are in the top 12 to 18 inches. So a couple problems with putting a rain garden underneath a tree. first you're digging down really deep. So you're going to damage a lot of the roots, at least on that one side of the tree. Then we're collecting water, right? So there's going to be water standing there. Not all trees can tolerate temporary flooding. So we want to keep that rain garden away from our trees if at all possible. This is an example of one of the images in that DNR publication on Guide to Designing and Installing a Rain Garden. And their recommendation is to try to get as level as possible of an area. A gentle slope is great because that'll help the water flow by gravity to your garden. But the steeper the slope, the digger the hole you're going to have to dig. So as you can see from this drawing, they take 2 posts, put a string, do a level, and then what you'll need to do is that top of the berm goes where that is level. That's a lot of soil, right? So then we're digging out the side on top, creating a ponding area so the water will collect, a berm, so if the water does overflow, it slows it down before it leaves the landscape. But hopefully you've got a big enough berm and a ponding area to capture the water. I like what this gardener did. They used a retaining wall to help adjust that slope. So then they had the water coming underground through the wall into that area. So they managed the slope that way. So they didn't have to excavate quite the same as you would coming down. They use a decorative feature and lights to highlight their garden. But even in a minimal slope like you see here, you can see how deep they've had to dig that garden bed and the size of that berm. So the goal here again is to capture the water coming off the roof, the walk, the grass, and then capturing it, in that ponding area. Now, if you're in the city of Milwaukee, this is not an issue, but some of you may be living in suburbs or other parts of the country where you have a septic or a well, and we want to keep our rain gardens away at least 5 feet from your septic and 8 feet from the well. And that way we don't have to worry about pollutants problems or overstressing our systems. Always contact your local utility company. 811 is the national number. So if you're not in Wisconsin, that number will work. If you are, it will also work. If you're in Wisconsin, you can file online at Diggers Hotline. And so call or file at least 3 business days before you put the first shovel in the ground. I also like to have them come out in the planning process as well, because if I don't know where all my underground utilities are, this helps me, oh, maybe I move the garden over this area to avoid it rather than have all my plans made and find out. You'll have to call them again because the marks are only good for 10 days, but it's great for that planning process. Why call them? It's a free service no matter where you live. Also, it could reduce the risk of injury or even death. You hit certain underground utilities, you can be injured. Even though there's recommendations for the depth, sometimes soil erodes, sometimes construction's done, sometimes they're not installed the way they should be. So that's why it's always best to call them. They only do public utilities, electric, phone, if you have a phone line, cable, and gas. And so they'll come out and mark it. So it's for your safety. It's for your convenience. You knock out cable, your family's not going to be too happy, and it can save you money because if you damage an underground utility and you didn't call, you're responsible for the repair. And none of us needs to spend our money that way. I want to spend it on plants. We also want to design for beauty and think about what complements your landscape style. This is a nice single-story home in Milwaukee, and that garden bed really blends nicely with the rest of their landscape. This gardener went more for a more natural look, and they have a larger home that created a nice backdrop for it. And then maybe you want something a little bit less wild and a little bit natural. And this gardener created a garden bed of rain garden plants and had seasonal beauty. Informal designs have curved, not straight lines. This is an island garden in the middle of the backyard. You can kind of see to the left where they ran the water in. They dug a little bit of a trench to lay that expandable pipe, that flexible drain tile, so they could continue to mow the grass without interruption, and then took it into the garden. perhaps a little more traditional style. And this was a rain garden we put in on the south side of Milwaukee. And she had a very narrow front yard. This is the front yard where we showed you where the lateral was. So she had a limited space. So her garden was long and narrow just to be able to fit in the available space. Now, when you're planting your garden, you may want to extend the beauty by just having your traditional foundation planting as the backdrop and then your rain garden in front of that. And that's another way to extend that beauty. So your rain garden looks like it's part of your foundation planting, but it's got that separation and that distance you need from your home. And then here's just another example where they already had an existing foundation planting, so they put their rain garden in front of that, connected it for easier maintenance. When you're designing, keep maintenance in mind. So we want it to look good, but we want it to be easy to maintain, because if it's not easy to maintain, in my book, if I have to hand trim, it's not happening in a timely manner. So this way, this is not a rain garden, but a good example of my friend Dorothy's yard, where she edges her garden beds. Notice those gentle curves. So when they cut the grass, they can easily follow that edge. So it's something to consider whether you're the one mowing the grass or someone else does. If it's easy, they're less likely to damage your garden plants and more likely to keep it looking good. So edging that garden bed, I'm a big fan of doing a physical edge with take a good sharp shovel, and I'm going to dig a trench. And then with rain gardens, you're going to have a slope in the middle. So basically that edge, using your shovels to keep the grass and the weeds from encroaching. And then we'll look at the berm on the other side. You may decide to use something physical like that other gardener did to create kind of a distinction between your rain garden and the surrounding lawn. But here, this gardener just used pavers or paving stones, and then just can run their mower tire over the edge so they can have a nice clean edge and slow the infiltration of weeds. Make sure you can access all parts. So either this gardener allowed an area wide enough to mow. So again, if you're going to have grass, make sure it's easy to get to so you don't have to hand trim. But what I like about this is that garden blends in with the backdrop of that other planting bed, but they can easily get their mower in and around. And especially if you're in the city. I used to live in the city on a small city lot, and over time, we eventually killed all the plants in our front yard, but we did leave a little mowing strip, so our neighbors knew that this was intentional. We had a mix of shrubs and flowers and things, and great way to absorb the moisture. But we did have to honor our neighbors by not necessarily our yard didn't look like theirs, but at least letting them know that this was an intentional garden. And you'll be amazed, because what I knew we were successful is when some teenager rode his bike through and goes, "Hey, nice garden, lady." So I'm sure you're going to get those high fives as well. And then all parts of the garden. So if you do have a large area and you're not going to have that mobile path, this is Alterra coffee shop down in Milwaukee, and they put steppers around so that they can get into all parts of their gardens to weed, to manage, and take care of things as needed. And then one of the things I always recommend when planning a landscape and a garden is in your home, look out the windows. Are they views you want to keep? Because you don't want to block a view if it's something beautiful. If you want to look at your rain garden, you want to make sure you have a good view of it. If it's not something you want to look at, then you think about doing some screening. So think about the areas. Is it the kitchen window where you do your dishes, where you're sitting in the evening watching TV out your living room or family room window? Do you spend time in an office, a home office, that you're looking out those windows? That may help you decide on placement of your rain garden as well. And then how does it look when you're on the sidewalk or the driveway looking in? When you come home from work, is it a wonderful greeting? Is it beautiful and make you happy and smile? And does it add some beauty to your neighborhood? And then make sure you can enjoy it. When I lived in the city, I always wanted a butterfly garden, and my ex-husband was also in horticulture, two plant people sharing a little yard, not the prettiest thing. And his vision of a butterfly garden was a weedy mess. And he goes, "Well, you can have the alley garden." Well, I planted a lot of good butterfly plants and I thought, okay, I'm not going to sit in the alley looking at it. But when we went to design our perennial garden, what he didn't realize is he picked all these great butterfly plants. So we had a butterfly garden in the front yard after all. And with your rain garden in front, look at all these plants. We've got daylilies that hummingbirds love. They got coneflower that butterflies, hummingbirds, and bees love. Yarrow, that's a great pollinator plant as well. And so a nice mix of plants that will bring in the songbirds and pollinators and a good view. But you always want to be careful about visibility. If you've got tall plants, you need to make sure you're not blocking the view if you're on a corner lot, or maybe when you're pulling out of your driveway, can you see? Do you have a good view of the walk if needed and of your front door so people know how to get to your front door to knock and let you know you're there. So always keep in mind that visibility factor. A lot of people, and myself included, do plantings in the tree border. And before you do that, you need to make sure it's allowed by your municipality. There may be some regulations on setbacks, or in my case, there wasn't a problem. It was I took the grass out, I put in planting beds. I did have some grass and put in a new walk. And understanding that if they had to come in and fix something in my tree border, they'd only put grass back. So just kind of find out what the regulations are in your municipality so you're not surprised or disappointed. And then be neighborly. And that's really challenging, right? If you live in the city and your houses are this close together and you want to put a rain garden in, you want to make sure your neighbor knows what you're doing because you got to live next to them. And, if you inform and talk about it, some friends of mine have had joint gardens between two houses as long as they had enough space, whether they were just ornamental or rain garden. So sometimes when you work with your neighbor, you get a solution that works for both of you. Okay, so let's focus a little bit on the function now. When you're designing your rain garden, if possible, you want the source of water perpendicular to the garden. As you can see here, their downspout comes out into the garden bed. And then you want it as close to the middle of the garden as possible. A couple of things I like about this garden, they had a narrow lot too, but they ran their downspout extension into the rain garden, but it went through the garden bed. So they had their foundation planting, then their rain garden, and they didn't have to mow around it or step over it. They made it easy to maneuver. And that is very important. You want to make sure that when you're directing the water to your rain garden, you're not creating a maintenance issue. If you have to pick up that downspout extension, it's not going to happen, right? The grass is going to get long until someone can't stand it, and it's going to be a nightmare. And so looking at either mulching around that, running it through the beds, anyway, and burying it, we'll look at an option later. And again, this is that garden I showed you earlier, and we saw that they made a trench for the flexible drain pipe that went through the garden. And so that was their way of managing it so they could continue to mow the grass. I just want to remind you again, have that traditional 2 feet of garden, or here they've got garden with mulch, and then their rain garden connects to that. So they're maintaining that integrity so that their sidewalk doesn't wash out in heavy rains as they're digging their garden. When spring arrives and we are gardeners, it's always hard to go to the garden center and not buy too many plants. It's also hard to look at the plant sale if you're eligible for MMSD's plant sale and not order too many plants, or plan for a huge garden like that first garden bed we looked at. And then the reality hits that you've got to dig that space. You've got to plant those plants. You got to keep the weeds down, especially the first couple of years. Do some watering if we have a hot, dry summer until they get established. So there is maintenance, especially the first couple of years. So think about that. 100 to 200 feet is kind of a good guiding place to start. 100 square feet is a 10 by 10 or a 10 by 10 garden. So that's a good size garden, and that will handle quite a bit of water. And my recommendation is start with one downspout at a time. You can collect as much as 623 gallons of water in a 1-inch rain from 1,000 square feet of roof. So think about all that water when we get a heavy rainstorm. Will it be able to handle it? And you'll be better off starting small with one downspout. See how that works for you. See how your design goes. You can expand the garden or put a second garden in at another downspout. And then evaluate the growing conditions and start with sunlight. Obviously, this is not where we're going to put a rain garden. This is a woodland area, and those are Dutchman's britches. But this reminds me to talk about the change of sunlight in the season. So think about your spring ephemerals, those wildflowers that bloom early in the season. And the leaves aren't out on the trees. And so they've got lots of sunlight. But as the leaves develop on the trees, it becomes much shadier. Your front yard or backyard could be the same way. Maybe you have a street tree that has bare, is bare in spring, but then those leaves on that maple are big and huge and cast a lot of shade on the landscape. So monitoring the sunlight throughout the day, morning to night, and then throughout the year is very important. When I lived in the city, my neighbor's house and mine were about maybe 8 feet apart, 8 feet apart. And I thought it was pretty shady from the two houses, but her house was south of mine, and there was enough light coming as the sun rose from the east and set in the west that I was able to grow sun-loving plants in a garden bed that I was sure was too shady because I was working away from home during the day, and I only saw it at the parts of the day that it was heavily shaded, but not while it was getting that intermittent light. So monitoring the sunlight, and then remembering too, angle of the sun changes throughout the year. So if you have a full sun garden, full sun area, those are garden beds that get at least 6, preferably 8 or more hours of sunlight. It could be full sun all day, maybe a south or a west facing yard, and that's going to give you lots of sunlight. East perhaps, but for those heat and dry loving plants, full sun to part sun. Full sun to part sun again can be that west face, early morning sun for those things that maybe don't like it hot, but like lots of sunlight. And then shade, 2 to 4 hours. So looking at those plants that receive, like marsh marigold, that's a native plant that grows in shaded, moist areas, great for shady rain gardens. And so that's a place for those. An east face would be okay for a part shade. Heavier shade might be under in an area where a building or a tree shades the garden bed. Next, evaluate the soil. Most of us don't have ideal soil. Most of us end up with what arborists often call disturbed sites, where there's been construction. They dig the foundation for your house. They sell off the topsoil. Some of that's changing in some areas. They spread that subsoil over that your landscape, put maybe 1 or 2 inches of topsoil, plant sod, and that's it. And we spend years trying to amend our soil. And the deeper you dig, sometimes the tougher that soil is. So you want to evaluate your soil before you get started. When I lived in the city, I had it was an old home, and I had variable soil. I think part of it was a dump at some point, and because I found all kinds of weird things when I dig. But I had a fair amount of clay, and so in heavy clay soil, the particles are like plates, and they hold the moisture and they drain slowly. Great during a dry year, but when we get regular rainfall, it can hold the soil too long. It does hold nutrients longer than, say, sandy soil, so that's a plus. Sand soil on the far right, that's what I'm dealing with now. I always tell people my soil looks like brown sugar. It has larger particles and they don't hold the moisture as well, and they drain quickly. So this just shows the difference in drainage patterns. Loamy soil has an equal part of clay, those flat, tiny particles, silt kind of in between, and sand. And so it drains well, but also holds moisture. So our goal is to have a soil that drains well, but also holds the moisture. Hopefully this isn't what it looks like, but you may want to evaluate the drainage. It will help you as you plan your garden because part of the depth is decided by how well your soil drains. And they cover that in that rain garden guide. So dig a hole a foot deep and, a foot wide, fill it with water, and then let it drain. Then you're going to fill it again, but this time you're going to measure how quickly that water drops. And you want to measure it after 15 minutes. And then you're going to multiply that by 4, right? Because 4 periods of 15 minutes gives you the hourly drainage rate. So what does that mean? Well, if it drains, if it drains 1 to 3 inches per hour, your soil drainage is ideal. Okay. If it's less than an inch per hour, you've got poor drainage. And so you're going to have to do some more amending or dig your rain garden deeper so that it can manage that water because it's going to take longer for the water to drain. And then if it's more than 4 inches, you've got fast draining soil. So you want to amend it. You may need to amend a little more so it holds the moisture during dry periods because rain gardens are designed to capture rainwater. But once established, we don't want to water them during dry periods. Those plants develop deep roots. We select plants that tolerate temporary flooding and temporary dry periods. So again, the depth you dig your rain garden is based on your soil type. And this soil doesn't actually look too bad. I'll tell you, you want to get some friends and family involved. This may help you decide on the size of your rain garden because you're going to be digging down 6 to 8 inches. And think about that soil that deep and how tough it is if it's clay. Once you get the depth, the proper depth, then you're going to amend that soil with some compost. And the idea here is adding compost to clay soil improves drainage. Adding it to sandy, fast draining soil helps it hold the moisture, and it has and organic matter also has nutrients. And so many municipalities do provide compost. If you are buying compost, I recommend asking how they're managing for jumping worms. In much of Wisconsin and parts of the Midwest and South, jumping worms are an issue. These are worms that ended up in the United States from Asia on plant material and other things. They are voracious organic matter eaters. So unlike earthworms, the problem is they can devour the organic matter and ruin soil drainage. I've had reports of one of the botanic gardens in Wisconsin. Some of their arborvitae just dropped over because the jumping worm populations were so high. They can spread up to 17 acres in a season. So avoiding it is the best thing because there's no easy control. There are things like dried mustard mixed with water that brings them and earthworms to the surface, and you can remove them. Heating the area to 104 degrees, fine for bare gardens, but if you've got plants and turf, you really can't do that. So avoiding the problem, asking how they manage it so you don't end up getting jumping worms, as well as compost. Testing your soil is important, and I would do that, before you add the organic matter, or you can do it after. Either way is fine, maybe even after, so you get the benefit on the reading. Now, what they measure is the phosphorus and potassium and the overall salts in the soil, the minerals in the soil, because nitrogen leaches out and it's not a long-lasting thing. That's why we fertilize regularly. Or non-available nitrogen is in the form of organic things like compost, slowly made available by microorganisms as they break it down. But the benefit is when you apply, go to your university extension service or a state certified soil lab. And then they'll tell you how to take the soil sample and where to send it. Then they send you a test report back that tells you what, if anything, you need to add. And that's a great service because you'll tell them, hey, I'm growing a rain garden, I'm growing some maybe mesic prairie plants, whatever. And then they'll base their recommendations on your soil test, but also what you're growing. Also consider how you're going to manage. This is my old house in the city of Milwaukee. So you can see I had a very narrow front yard, a bigger tree border. I was at the bottom of the hill, so I always shoveled, but my neighbors didn't always. And so the snow would melt and I'd end up with ice. And I tried to minimize my use of de-icing salt because that's hard on our water and it's hard on our planting and it's hard on cement. So if you shovel first, try not to shovel snow into your rain garden if you have that option, because you don't want to overload it as the snow melts. And definitely don't put any snow contaminated with de-icing salt on your rain garden, because that disrupts the soil structure, and that's critical for any garden, but especially a rain garden that you're trying to use to manage lots of water. Make sure to select hardy plants. So if you're in the MMSD service area and you're buying plants on their rain garden sale, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, those are all hardy. The USDA did come with updating their plant hardiness map. And so basically when I looked across the country, some states were not impacted at all. The most difference was a half of zone. So maybe a 5A became a 6B, and so it may have gone a half a zone higher, or a 5B became a 5A. And so that's the average minimum winter temperature. Now, the other day we had 13 degrees at my house after we had 70 degrees the day before. So we're really experiencing some crazy weather. Part of the change is due to a more recent evaluation over a 20-year period of temperatures, the average minimum temperature, and they've also got more points where they're accessing data, so a little more accurate, especially with topography, lakes, and things like that. If you are in Wisconsin and you live along the lake, you are now classed as a 6A. That's that green line right along the lake. Now, I used to live on 16th Street, and I know I could grow things that I can't grow now that I'm further away from the city. And even though I am a 5B, I really usually do 4B or 5A plants unless I can put them in a sheltered area, just because I can get some extremes, maybe not long term, but enough extremes that can harm my plants. So this is one factor of many: sunlight, soil, average minimum winter temperature. But then on the other end, average summer heat. I talked to a plantsman out of Vancouver, British Columbia. They had some crazy weather the last few years with record high temperatures. And he was telling me he works with a lot of breeders, and they're breeding plants to be tolerant of extreme heat and extreme cold, because that's what we're seeing in those rapid changes as well. Make sure the plants are manageable. This is cup plant. I like cup plant, but cup plant is the leaves form these little cups that capture the water, and they are really aggressive and assertive. And so you want to make sure that the plants you're putting in there not only tolerate the soil, but they also won't take over your landscape. Look for things with seasonal interest. Winters can be long depending on where you live. And boy, we've been teased with spring all winter long. And even though it's the end of February now, it feels like spring is never going to get here, because we've had that little taste and we can't wait. But we have to look at snow or gray or bare landscapes. How can you brighten it with seed heads that will bring in the birds some winter interest? And it doesn't have to be that exciting. This is Anise hyssop in one of my garden beds, or this might have been in a garden in the Quad Cities. But look at how pretty that is. It's just beautiful, the texture. Now, if you're down south, you have things like crepe myrtles, and your camellias are probably blooming. But when you're in the north, this is what we call winter interest. And then think about things that are going to bloom in spring for a couple of reasons. Providing some nectar for early pollinators, bees, the hummingbirds love columbine, things that are going to brighten your landscape. I'll tell you, the first signs of life in the garden are always welcome. And this is our native columbine. Takes full sun to part shade and moist, well-drained soils. In the summer, what's going to be blooming? This is butterfly weed. And then the purple is the wild bergamot, a type of monarda. I wanted to mention butterfly weed. It's great for hot, dry conditions. So in your rain garden, this would be in the areas where you would put plants that tolerate it hot and dry. Those moisture lovers, like your sedges that takes, if it's a sunny area, that take wet and sunlight, would be in the lower part because that's going to stay wet longer. Or if you're growing swamp milkweed, it likes it moist. It could go in the center. I also want to mention butterfly weed. We're all trying to support the monarch caterpillars, and any milkweed will be a good host plant for them. The reason, if you have fast draining soil and full sun, butterfly weed is a good choice because it's a lot less aggressive than common milkweed. Common milkweed's a wonderful plant, but it not only spreads by seed, but underground rhizomes that are like 9 or 12 inches below ground. So it can easily take over a garden bed or a small landscape. So if you've got the sunlight, butterfly weed. If you've got moisture conditions and maybe a little bit heavier soil, swamp milkweed's taller, pink flowers, but it also tends to be less aggressive. And then think about some beauty for fall for you and the pollinators. You can see this bee is enjoying this aster. Goldenrods and asters, those fall bloomers provide needed nectar and pollen for migrating insects and those late season pollinators. So you may be overwhelmed. Okay, so you go to the plant sale, you look at the page, you try to order your plants, you're like, where do I get started? I don't even know how to get started. Fresh Coast Guardians has some sample plans on their website, and I think that's a great place to start. You know, I heard a landscape designer one time say, we're not all creative from the get-go. We borrow from each other and improve on the design. So that's a good starting point. You may go, oh, I could put this there instead, but it's a way to get you started. Then when you've got your idea of where you want the garden, use a power cord or rope or something to mark the bed. Once you can move that, kick that around, you feel happy, then you can mark it with paint, and that will make the digging much easier. And then, you know, there have been times I've had to use several colors of paint because I'm like, oh, this isn't working. I thought it was good until I painted the line. And then you're going to continue to adjust throughout the process. When you get those plants, you start laying them out. Don't worry, you'll probably be adjusting. But when you're getting ready to plan for that excess soil. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to move it? Make sure you have some help and some wheelbarrows, right, to move it where you need it. Or maybe you're going to throw it on a tarp until you can transport it as needed. What are you going to do with all that sod? You're going to take out the sod. You may be digging it by hand. We rented a sod cutter for that garden, and it was great. Our volunteers were really grateful, and so was I. And so we cut that sod, and we ended up using it to help the homeowner in another area where she had some bare soil. You could maybe use that excess soil to fill low spots, to patch damaged lawn areas. Those of you in areas with snow, unfortunately, you may be looking at some of the plow damage. And so amending that soil raking, and if you need to fill in, maybe you need to fix the grade by your house. You want that soil grading away, so that excess soil and sod could be used for that. I like to use my sod that I use a sod cutter for. I turn it green side down, layer it on, put some Milorganite in between, which is a slow release fertilizer, and then just layered upon layer. Cover it with plastic. I did this garden, I started a new garden bed in fall, so I did this layering of the sod, covered it with plastic, kind of cooking some of those weeds over winter. And then I had some of the best tomatoes ever that year. You might want to share the sod, but if you think you might have jumping worms, keep that sod on your own property. I just want to run through this project that I did. This was an apartment complex. And please note the downspout that was disconnected. And I found the bottom of it laying in the planting bed because I think whoever was mowing the grass ripped it, probably knocked it off because it was in the way. So this was the corner we decided to work from. And there's the downspout extension. So we called Digger's Hotline, which added to the challenge because the electric line went right through that bed. So we couldn't excavate too deeply. We had to plan to run that pipe above ground. this was going to be a big garden bed. And so I started by putting some stakes and running the rope around, kind of adjusting as I went. Again, making sure it was 10 feet from the building. And then you can see the drainage pattern here. So you could see it was going downhill. I was only taking water off of one corner of the building, but it's a big building and that's a big area. So I was marking the bed. As I mentioned, I used actually skewers and rope, and then I marked the bed, and then I decided I needed to change it once I marked it. So you can see I kind of was adjusting accordingly. And then I was marking where I was going to run the downspout from the building to as close to the center of the garden as possible. And that was a pretty big stretch. And this soil was terrible. And so we had to use pickaxes and shovels, and some strong volunteers worked with me. And we dug a trench because we were burying that downspout extension so that knowing how the maintenance worked, that would happen easier and it wouldn't be damaged. But you can see the lousy soil, and taking that, and we set the sod to the side because we reused it when we were finished as a soil as well. So we put our flexible drain pipe down, and then notice we put a guard at the end because you don't want any animals going up there and dying and blocking the flow of water, and the smell would be awful. We put gravel and stone. Those big stones we dug up while we were digging our rain garden. Tells you that site was pretty tough. And then mulched it. So we brought that water into the garden bed. Now, our soil was terrible, but we were busy doing this, so I didn't have pictures from that, but we ended up doing some vertical mulching. That soil was so lousy, and we spread compost, and then we used, I brought my cordless drills and some auger bits, and we did drainage holes throughout. And I'll tell you, it was even tough doing. So that allowed for drainage, work that compost down better than we were able to, kind of pushed it down even further and opened it up, aerating that soil. Hopefully that's not what you have to do. Then we got busy planting. This was our finished product. And we mulched the garden bed. Oh, and if you could, and as you saw, we put that sod back in place. I did kind of readjust where we ran the downspout, thus the different color of paint. So we reconnected the downspout extension that was ripped off the building, and then attached our flexible pipe, and we had to elevate it so it wouldn't pull down on that downspout. Ran it through the garden bed to where it got buried. So it was out of the way for cutting grass. So main thing I want to say is thanks for being part of the solution. Take some time to find the best place. Think about how you can add beauty and function to your landscape by installing a rain garden. So my next one is March 14th on how to select rain garden plants. You may not want to wait that long, so we'll kind of help you maybe arrange them as you're planting. 7 steps for managing water where it falls in your yard. So we'll give a shout out to rain gardens, but also talk rain barrels, healthy landscapes, amending your soil, that type of thing, and how to plant your rain garden. So once you get those plants, how to get them in the ground and give them some good post-planting care so they make it through the first growing season and get established. And then we get lots of questions on fall landscape planting and care. So hopefully you'll join me again so we can talk about what you need to do to help your landscape prepare for winter, no matter where you live, and kind of planting you can do. So this is Milwaukee Metro Sewage District's parking lot, the day of last year's plant sale pickup. This year, the sale is on, and I'd recommend you go there soon. It goes through April 4th or while supplies last. So March 14th is our selecting plants, and we'll cover all the plants that are included. But I would recommend you start taking a look and start making your list. You can save a lot of money because their goal is to get native plants that are really hard to find at most garden centers, but to give you an option to buy native plants at a discount rate because they want you to plant rain gardens to help keep water where it falls. You do need to buy at least $45 minimum. Hey, who can't use $45 worth of plants? Just that's to help with cost. And then last but not least, before we get to the Q&A section, I just want to ask you to help me grow gardeners. This is a family planting their rain garden. They got the kids involved. You know, look for helping gardeners of any age. Something inspired you to get started, and hopefully once you put your rain garden in, your neighbors are going to want to do the same. Kids are more focused. Girls suffer less peer pressure when they are raised in a landscape environment. Kids perform better. They're more focused. We all know we feel better. There's a lot of stress in this world right now, and kids are really feeling a lot of it. And so getting them out in nature, getting them digging in the soil, getting them planting, we all can use that stress reduction. It helps you be more focused and more creative. So inspire someone, whether they're the kids in your life, a young family gardening for the first time, a new retiree, or just a friend that is a little timid, share your expertise. And if you're new to gardening, welcome. We're happy to have you. My contact information is on the handout. Please stay in touch. If you post questions, be patient and don't feel bad if you have to nudge me and remind me. Again, thanks to Fresh Coast Guardians and Milwaukee Metro Sewage District for sponsoring this webinar. Sometimes we don't appreciate things that happen in our own community. When I travel and talk about working with Milorganite and MMSD to keep water where it falls, both organizations have a lot of respect around the country because they are trying to work to manage water, asking all of us to be part of it. So consider joining Fresh Coast Guardians. These are all everyday people that just agree to help make a difference and protect our Great Lakes waterways and such. So I'm happy to turn it back to Kelly and to all of you to answer questions that you may have on rain gardens or horticulture and gardening in general.
All right, thank you, Melinda, so much for this great presentation. So what a great way to kick off the season. I have posted a link in the chat to MMSD's plant sale.
Thank you.
As well, definitely, as well as Melinda's handout. The link is in there. Also, just FYI, we are recording this webinar and we will share out the link to the library's YouTube channel probably in a few days with the link to that and then the attachments and everything we talked about today. So let's get to questions. So Jason's wondering, his question is, would this attract a lot of mosquitoes? I'm guessing Jason means like rain gardens in general. Are they attractive to mosquitoes?
Great question. So here's a couple things. They need to drain within 24 to 48 hours. Mosquito larvae need 7 hours to go from larval stage to adults. One of the things we'll talk about with managing water on your property, if you do rain barrels, and then they're not closed, throwing a mosquito dunk, which is made from Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis, it kills mosquito larvae. So you throw a dunk in, you get 30 days of control. It's safe if wildlife were to drink out of it, or you use that water to water plants. It's a naturally occurring soil bacteria. One of the cool things that I've seen done with mosquito dunks, if you have those areas that are temporary flooding, and I said, don't put a rain garden there, people will take a rebar, run it through that mosquito dunk. So if water collects there for more than a week, it's there and available to kill the larva. And then when the water recedes, it stays in place until that floods again. But rain gardens, that's a great question. Rain gardens are really designed to drain quickly, so they're not, so the larvae, they're not attracted in terms of the water. Now, mosquitoes do like to, the adults do like to hang out in bushes and tall grass and things, but usually with a rain garden, I haven't had a lot of complaints. Plus, you're inviting songbirds and beneficial insects in with that selection of plants, and they feed on mosquitoes. So that's another good benefit. You'll get the beneficial insects, you'll get the birds that eat the mosquitoes. So that's the other way that we're using rain gardens to manage it. But that's a great question. Thank you, Jason.
Got a couple questions from Marlene. First question, Marlene is wondering if you have suggestions for plants that could go in a bioswale that's mostly in shade, but it gets early morning sun and afternoon sun.
So a couple things to keep in mind. One, they're a great plant list. If you're not, especially if you're not in the Wisconsin area or Southeast Wisconsin, most states now are producing good rain garden plant lists. So here are a couple of things. Sedges are excellent. Check. Some sedges like full sun, some sedges take shade. We have a rain garden at the We Energy Park at State Fair, and it gets a fair amount of shade. So here are some of the things. We have palm sedge, pretty assertive sedge. I'll tell you, we had to do some digging and dividing, and we all took a trunk full of sedge home for our own rain gardens. But it takes the rain. It's beautiful. It's about 12 inches tall. The leaves come off the main stem, kind of glisten in the sun. So look for the sedges that take that moist soil, and many are shade tolerant. This Muskingonensis, the palm sedge. Turtle head is our native turtle head, grows about 3 or 4 feet tall, will tolerate shade, blooms late in the season, takes moist soils, a great bioswale rain garden plant. Marsh liatris, marsh blazing star, has purple flowers mid to late summer. It grows about 3 to 5 feet tall, depending on sunlight. It'll take some shade. So I'd put it in the area where it's going to get the most sunlight in that area. Cardinal flower, a little tricky. It will take the moist soil. As long as there's decent drainage, it will take full sun to part shade. I've seen it in fairly shady areas. Don't be discouraged, because one of the problems I find with cardinal flowers, finding the right spot. I meet gardeners that, it grows great for me. It's taken me a couple tries to find a good spot in my 2 different landscapes. And but that is one that you might want to consider. Joe Pye weed, there are cultivars that are a little shorter. Little Joe is only 3 feet tall. Gateway is like 5 feet tall, and the species is even taller. Late season bloomer, tolerates, it really needs moist soil. So that's a big plus as well. And it will take part shade. So one of the things I do is start monitoring for the sunlight. Marsh marigold, I showed you in the beginning, those leaves last all season. That is very shade tolerant. And that's a spring bloomer. And so you'd get the flowers early, and it's short. It's only about 8 or 12 inches tall. So you'd get the flowers early, but the leaves would persist, and they're a glossy green. So those are kind of my top choices that I think I would start with those. I'm going down my plant list of things that I've grown. Swamp milkweed. That's a 3 to 5 foot tall summer bloomer, pink flowers, great for the monarchs. It will take some moisture as well. So those are some of the things to keep in mind. I think those would be some excellent options. Tippecanoe Library on the south side of Milwaukee, where I first met Kelly years ago, has a nice bioswale and a rain garden as well. So, and permeable pavers in their parking lot. So if you're anywhere near Howard and Howell, stop by the library, and they have a seed library there too. But stop by, check out the parking lot. Very cool, very interesting, doing the things that they're encouraging all of us to do.
Thanks for that shout out, Melinda. Yeah, we have some really cool green infrastructure features at a handful of our other branches as well, but Tippecanoe is like the green branch. So so yeah, definitely check it out if you're in the area.
And you have a green roof downtown. Can people tour that? I'm going to, because I'm planning on
yeah.
visiting.
Yeah, we'd love it. Yeah, so we do tours of the Green Roof. So this is downtown Central Library. This is located on 8th and Wisconsin Avenue. There's a Green Roof. We do tours. I want to say they are Wednesdays in the afternoon. However, I will check on that, and I can certainly send more information in our follow-up email. If you check out mpl.org,
That's great.
it should be searchable as well. So yeah, I think the tours generally start sometime in May, I want to say, kind of during the nicer weather here. But yeah, we'd love to welcome everyone. If you're interested in having a tour, please check that out.
Thanks.
So,
Sorry to put you on the spot, but
oh, no worries.
they're very cool green roofs. So thanks.
Definitely. All right. So Marlene's second question is just wondering if you have suggestions to refurbish a rain garden. It says in parens, sunny slope that hasn't been weeded for a couple of years, and it's now overrun with thistles and other nasty invasives.
Oh, I'll tell you. And that's so you're not alone. It's so easy to fall behind on maintenance, whether you inherited the garden from somebody or, health issues, schedule issues, hot weather. The weeds have done great the last couple years, and rain has been lacking for much of the country. So it's understandable. I would start by managing the weeds, getting those weeds out and replacing them with rain garden plants to start getting them. And when you're removing the plants, you want to make sure you get the roots as well as the top growth. Um, Really, I try not to use chemicals, and especially in a rain garden, because the soil structure is so important. And I'm guessing it's pretty dense. And spring is a time to do this. And if you could get at the weeds early in the season, that'll give you a head start. You'll see what kind of open space you have. And then you can start filling it with rain garden plants to get them to help crowd out the weeds. So start by getting rid of the invasives for sure. Get rid of those weeds. Fill in those empty spaces with good plants that you want that are suited to the conditions. And then if we could get at the weeds early in the season, one, it's easier to dig them out. And two, they have so much sunlight because the other plants haven't sprouted that's when they really get a foothold and take over. So the earlier we can get out and weed, the better. And there's no easy solution, I'm afraid. And then mulching. I forgot to mention mulching when we talk planting. I'm a big believer in mulch, so spreading a layer of wood chips on top, shredded leaves. You kind of have to be careful with the organic matter. That's why I like wood chips because they break down slowly. They hold the soil in place. Leaves could kind of be floating. So if you could get some shredded bark or wood chips, that will also help suppress weed seeds from sprouting, conserve moisture, which is important those first few years. Once your plants grow and mature, they're going to really need very minimal, if any, mulch at all because they'll fill that space.
Husband and I used cocoa shells
Yeah,
last summer also as some mulch, and so it smells amazing.
it does. It's pretty too. And if you have dogs, be careful because some dogs eat
Yeah.
it and it can kill them. But
Mhm.
yeah, it is a pretty mulch.
Our next question from Jay. So Jay's referring to one of the photos you had earlier in the slide deck with neighboring garden, the neighboring garden with a narrow lot with that rain garden along the
Right.
sidewalk. Is that a no-no? Like, was that an example of something not to do since it was so on the property line?
Well, that was why be neighborly. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked because the point was to be neighborly. So that's when you want to talk to your neighbor. And what I think would have been this was a slide I got from MMSD. So unless they didn't tell me, my point is you want to make sure you're talking to your neighbor. So thanks for bringing that up, Jay, because if I'm assuming they talked to their neighbor and they got permission to do that. I look at that and thought, boy, the neighbor had a downspout close by. They could have tripled the size, jointly done that garden. And that could be really cool. A friend of mine actually used to work with Milorganite, and we've shot some video at his home. He and his former neighbor used to have a shared garden bed. So they had a compost in the middle. They masked that with plantings, and it was a huge garden that they could have greater impact between their yards. But you've got to get agreement. So I'm glad you brought that up because you do want to talk. That was be neighborly. Make sure that you talk to your neighbor if you're going to do that. Otherwise, look for a different solution.
So Jill is wondering about jumping worms. She said, I've been hesitant to buy plants and pots in recent years due to jumping worms. Would you know if the MMSD plants that they have for sale are free from jumping worms?
That's a great question. I'm hoping, I haven't heard that there have been an issue. Um, let me, I'll find out how they're managing them. I'm sure they're not intentionally introducing. Where we find problems with jumping worms are plants in pots that are set on the ground. Most potting mixes are sterile that garden centers and nurseries use. So jumping worms aren't a problem in those potted plants, but when the garden center or nursery puts them on the ground, that's where you can get problems. Also sharing plants. Somebody when a horticulturist said to me the saddest part that he has about having jumping worms is he can't share plants anymore because he'd be sharing jumping worms because they're in his yard. And so taking, when you're digging and dividing your garden, if you think you have jumping worms, and there's a great video, video on jumping worms from the University of Wisconsin, Madison Arboretum. And it's a 1 hour webinar, and he does a great job of going through the whole, the life cycle, the kind of things. Unfortunately, we don't have a cure yet, but really is an awareness. So as far as I know, no, but you know what, Kelly, let me just double check. I'm sure they're not wanting to introduce jumping worms, but let me find out how they're managing them, how they're growing them, and then we can share that as well. So good question. Always ask field grown plants. That sometimes is a problem. Nurseries, if they have jumping worms and they dig the plants, ball and burlap, they could end up. I have been at a garden center, not one I work with, where I needed a plant quick. I picked it up, found jumping worms underneath, put the plant down, let them know, and didn't go back. So I understand. And that's the same with compost and mulch. When buying it, ask how they manage it. And if they go, what are jumping worms? It'd be time to find another option. So it's a tough situation.
All right, we've got some more questions coming in. CJ would like to know, can you run your sump pump pipe into a rain garden or just downspouts?
Yes, you can run your sump pump depending on how much it's running. I think most of us have decent drainage. And so, yes, you can. I was at a small lot in Milwaukee, and they had this beautiful rain garden near their garage. And that's what they did. They ran their sump pump in there. And again, just knowing how much your sump pump runs so that you know how much water you need to manage to adjust the size of your rain garden. So good question, Jay.
The question from Kathleen. Kathleen says, last year I had thistle weeds take over my rain garden. Is there anything I should do at the beginning of the season to help prevent that from reoccurring?
So again, get out there as soon as they sprout and dig. Keep after it on a regular basis. I know there's some debate. I like using, as I mentioned, some either shredded or wood chip mulch that tends to stay put even with the water. Lighter mulches can float, but especially initially, it helps. Think about last summer, if you're in the Wisconsin area, we had some pretty hot temperatures. So not only dry, but the heat is hard on the roots of plants, and especially young plants that are getting established until they dig down and, have those deep roots. That's something to keep in mind. So I think mulching, digging, no easy solution. If you get them early, wear some good gloves because they are prickly. I'm not a fan of using herbicides in the rain garden because of the disruption to the soil. And so again, digging, mulching, getting new plants in there to fill the void so that they can help crowd out the weeds, and then keeping after it. And I know that's hard, easier said. I got my share of weeds, trust me.
We actually got that question a couple of times, so it sounds like it's on
thistles did well. Thistles did well last year.
Mm-hmm. So Jill's wondering if you have any resources for a low area, the drain tile and one downspout drainage from a metal roof. You said other steps need to take place besides the rain garden.
Okay, good point. So if you have a low spot where water collects, your best bet would be to put the rain garden between that low spot and the house. So you will collect some of that water before it gets to that low spot. The reason you don't want to put it, if you've got water that stands on a regular basis, you're going to have issues because it's not going to drain well, wherever that water's coming from, or if it's poorly drained. So French drains, where you dig down, put a trench, a gravel trench, cover it with weed barrier, cover it with soil so that it drains better. So you're trying to create better drainage and speed that up. Again, if you've got room between the house and that low spot in the landscape, what you don't want to do is end up pushing the water to somebody else's. When I grew up, all my neighbors where my parents' house was, everybody filled their low spot and it all ended up in my dad's backyard. And we get ducks coming in to visit us. That might be, so I think just trying to intercept that water that you can manage yourself and then try to speed drainage in that area. So the rain garden between the house and that low spot. If it's a lot of water, you might want to enlist the help of rain barrels that you can then collect the water and use in other areas like containers and things. And then that idea of using a French drain. And you might even want to, if it's a severe problem, you might even want to get a soil specialist or a landscape architect that deals with drainage issues that can come help you find ways to manage the water. If it's a severe enough problem, they can help you without seeing it. But, you know, it's a little challenging to know how severe this is. So we just don't want that to water garden if you've got standing water for weeks on end. Should drain in 24 to 48 hours.
Got some more questions about weeds. Nick says an arborist recently suggested pouring hot water on weeds or grass that creeps where you don't want it. Is that effective? And someone else was wondering about handling bishop's weed. Could that be an answer? Boiling water?
Good question. So hot water may not always burn the top. It'd have to be pretty hot. It would burn the top, but not the root. So a lot of those, so there's a lot of good organic plant killers that only burn the tops off. They use plant oils like Burnout, smells wonderful because it has clove oil. Vinegar we talked about, and there is a publication in last night's invasive plant webinar that Liz Tanner put. If you do vinegar weed killer vinegar is a weed killer USDA, you'll probably get to that handout. One of the problems with using vinegar you buy at the grocery store, the concentration is usually not hot enough to do the damage, and it usually just burns the top. The organic weed and grass killers use fatty acids, kind of soap, kind of at a high concentration. So I think there are better options if you wanted to do something. I'd probably use one of the organics to burn the top off. And then you'll have to keep repeating it. So would you be just as well off to just cut it at the ground level on a regular basis and starve it to death? Because that's basically the same thing. Those products are great in cracks in the pavers and sidewalks because it's organic. So if people walk barefoot over, it kind of burns them. Because when you're pulling the roots out, you're bringing soil and more weed seeds up or disturbing them and exposing more weed seeds. So that might be a place to use it. Hot water, if it's going to kill your weeds, what's it going to do in the soil? And it's just not going to do, you're just not going to get the good enough control for it. So you could try it in a patio or paver area, but I wouldn't put it in your garden.
So Tanya's wondering thoughts on adding edible plants in the rain garden mix.
So one of the concerns is I've had somebody recommend tomatoes, and I'm like, you don't want to do tomatoes in a rain garden because of blossom end rot. It's moisture imbalance. And so one of the problems is think about what rain gardens do. They collect water, they stay wet for a while, then they can go very dry because once they're established, you don't want to be watering your rain garden, right? And so they're exposed to flooding and drought. So a lot of the initial plants that were selected for rain gardens and those that you'll see from the MMSD, many of them are mesic prairie plants. These are plants that are native to areas that have wet and dry periods, and they're adapted to that. Most edible plants aren't going to tolerate that. I'm trying to think if there's anything that would work well in a rain garden. You're really better off to do a separate vegetable garden. And if you're limited space, do some pots instead of trying to make it work in your vegetable garden. Because on the edge, it's going to be very dry. Towards the center, it's going to be wet. I just don't think you can manage the moisture. And if you think about your vegetable garden, if we don't get an inch of rain a week, you're usually doing some watering, right? And the idea of a rain garden is not to do any watering, but get plants established that can handle it and live on their own. So I would recommend, I can't think of any edible plant that would do well in flooding and drought and flooding and drought. And that, so keep your veggies in I think you'll have much better success keeping your vegetables in the vegetable garden.
So Jason's wondering how like rain garden plants have evolved evolved to draw up more water. Would that be because of their root systems?
True, exactly. So one of the reasons MMSD, the plants that they're selling being native plants, tend to be deeply rooted. So great question. So those extend their roots deep in the ground. So a couple reasons they're helpful. So one, they have a bigger, more robust root system, so they can draw water from more locations. As their roots, old roots die, they add organic matter deep in the soil. Organic matter helps hold moisture, and it also opens pathways for water to drain. So it's doing a couple of things as well. And so, yeah, so they've adapted. And then some of them have adaptations on their leaves as well, whether it's a hairy leaf pubescence, so they don't lose moisture. The are they narrow leaves versus wide flat leaves? Do they angle their leaves? Think of compass plant, how the leaf direction changes with the sun. And so that's ways that it helps them lose less moisture and also access more moisture from the ground. Great question.
Yeah. So, got a question from Mary. Mary was the one that asked about the bishop's weed.
Oh, thank you. I forgot.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, thoughts on handling bishop's weed, and yeah, it sounds like she was at the invasive webinar last night too, and we didn't talk much about that one.
I'm sorry. Yes, I try to cover way too much. So here's the deal with bishop's weed. Once used as a ground cover, often people buy an old home and it comes with bishop weed. And so it takes over the garden and it continues to spread. So a couple things that I would suggest, Mary, if the whole garden bed is infiltrated with bishop's weed, I would consider either saying, we're just going to get rid of everything and start over, or dig up the plants you want to keep, pot them up for a while to make sure you didn't get any of the rhizomes, because the last thing you want to do is get rid of the bishop's weed in that garden and then put your perennials back in and infect it with bishop's weed that made it out with that division. So if I had a garden bed that was taken over by bishop's weed, I'd probably consider doing solarization if I could stand the time. And so edging the garden bed, and the reason we edge the garden bed is if there's any grass feeding in from the outside, or to try to stop the bishop weed rhizomes from going out and then escaping. Then we're going to cover that area with clear plastic. And this, we're talking about sacrificing, if you can, 4 to 6 weeks, even more is better, to cook that soil. And that kills the tops and it heats up the soil enough to kill the rhizomes. Think about sitting in your car in the winter on a sunny day. The sun comes through those car windows, it warms things up. And so you end up getting warm even though it may be very cold outside. So what we're trying to do is heat up that soil to kill the roots. The other option is to use a total vegetation killer, but you're going to end up doing it several times. So again, I would consider just kind of calling that bed, if it's totally infested, just saying, okay, I'm going to manage this bishop's weed this summer, this gout weed. And then next year, if I'll keep monitoring, but you should be ahead of the problem. And be able to get new plants in and manage whatever few things resprout. Because that's one of the problems with invasive plants and weeds, right? They drop their seeds. It's not a once and done thing. So using a total vegetation killer like a Roundup, Finale is a different mode of action. It came out about the same time Roundup did, a little more pricey. They didn't do the advertising that they did for Roundup, so a lot of people have never heard of it. So you might want to check out Finale if you're a little hesitant to use Roundup. Regular mowing, you've got to just be more persistent than the plant. You miss a plant, part of a plant, and it can just feed the rest of the rhizomes. So solarization, you can use smothering, but it's going to take a while because those rhizomes are deep. And so it takes a whole season, I would think, to smother it. And I'd still be a little nervous that I didn't get those rhizomes under the ground killed. For anybody that wasn't with us last night, if you have invasive plant problems, bishop's weed is considered invasive. And if you've got it, you believe it. On the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources website, if you just do WIDNR, Wisconsin DNR, and then put Bishop's goutweed. That'll take you to the page that describes it, talks about control options. If you're from another state, your local Department of Natural Resources, your Extension Service probably has helpful information, but it's a good place to start no matter where you live to get some ideas on controlling that and other invasive plants.
So Tanya is wondering, when you use the solar method, doesn't it also kill worms and other beneficial organisms?
So one of the things that we do with you, well, first of all, worms are not native here. Even our earthworms, they were wiped out during the Ice Age. I know nobody knows. Earthworms are a problem in natural areas like northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Northeast, where fisher people throw their worms in the woods and they're devouring the organic matter. In a garden, why we like them, they aerate, they don't move. Those things are going to move out of the area, the worms, any of those beneficial. The solarization it will kill the weeds, it will kill some disease organisms. I'd rather do solarization than covering it with black plastic. Plastic is hard on your plant. So this is one of those things, how do you manage it? Do you use herbicides? Do you dig? And that's hard because of the rhizomes and the seeds. Or do you use clear plastic or do you smother? Cardboard and wood chips would be another option, but I'd edge the bed first. There have been some people that find cardboard, they feel that's a problem. I've used cardboard and wood chips as a mulch and have not seen any issues with the plants I used it around. So from experience, I haven't seen issues. So you bring up a good point. Plastic is hard on the soil. It blocks the oxygen, it blocks the rainfall. It's got to be moist when you cover it. There's, if you are in the north, University of Minnesota has an article on solarization and octitation. I don't think I'm saying it right, but that's smothering. But if you do solarization, University of Minnesota, if you are in the west or south, California, which I look at their information too, has some information on solarization. So good point. The other option is cardboard and wood chips, because cardboard will last. It eventually breaks down and adds organic matter to the soil. So you're improving the soil while you're smothering the weeds. But you've got to make sure you edge that bed. Otherwise, those weeds are going to come out from the edge and support who's underneath. So good question. Good comment.
This is more, I guess more of a comment than a question. So Jay, going back to the neighborly garden image, he said he was asking more about the walkway, kind of how to handle that if that's
right. Okay,
issue.
sorry, Jay. So one of the things I'm hoping that they had regular plants in that walkway area and the rest was rain garden. I have seen people put the plants rain garden, you want to be careful. So that may not be the best place for a rain garden. That's where you want to get to know your neighbor and see if you could take care of both your downspouts. One of the things the city of Milwaukee is trying to encourage people to disconnect their downspout, running it to the rain garden or into the landscape. But there are places they're not requiring it because you can't run it anywhere. There's no space. And so you bring up a good point. So these are all things as you look at your property. If you have some good rain garden pictures, I'd love to get them because I'm really struggling. So these were provided, most of these were provided by MMSD, except the gardens that I put in. And so, yes, we're always looking for good examples. So, and I don't know if that person put it in or the volunteers did, but again, keep in mind those guidelines. And so maybe rather than fixating on what might be wrong with that one, hopefully what can you do right in your garden? So making sure you manage the integrity, making sure you're neighborly. If you've got a narrow yard, is your neighbor going to be upset? Trust me, I was with a group of arborists and we talked about people wanting the arborist who came to prune trees to prune the neighbor's branches hanging over the yard or even take out their neighbor's trees when they weren't looking. We all have to get along, right? So you bring up a good point, Jay. We want to make sure the integrity of the sidewalk, we want to be neighborly, make sure the rain garden can manage that walk. Because the other problem is are we going to have water flowing over into the sidewalk? So you want to make sure you're not building up issues with water running into the walk for ice and snow buildup too when you disconnect or do a rain garden.
So again, just a reminder, everyone, probably early next week is my guess. We'll be able to send out a follow-up email with a link to this recording. And then we'll also include links to register for upcoming webinars. We have another one on March 14th with Melinda. And so be sure to sign up for that one. We'll also send that handout that Melinda has to go along with this recording. And then also the link to the MMSD plant sale, which, as Melinda said, is open until April 4th or until supplies last. So whatever comes first.
That's right. So order early because they do, I think they sold out last spring. So definitely take advantage. It's a great opportunity to get some cool plants and get your rain garden started, or fill in those empty spots when you get the thistles out.
All right. Well, that is all that I'm seeing for questions tonight. Thank you so much, Melinda, for another great workshop. It's exciting to get in the spring mode. You know,
It
it's
sure is.
been a long winter. So thanks to everyone for joining us tonight, and we will see you again soon. So please check out mpl.org if you're interested in those greener tours and more green programming. And then also you can also take a look at some of our branch locations that have green infrastructure if you want to do a little library green tour around the city. It sounds like a fun idea.
Thanks so much to all of you, and thanks, Kelly, for hosting.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. We'll see you next time.
Good night.
Bye-bye.